Hi friends, this is Jairam Sridharan from Piramal Finance. In my usual annual ritual, I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the budget. We tried not to do this immediately the day after the budget because there are like a million people talking about a million things on the budget, and we like to sit back and reflect and think about what we have seen, spend some time with the complex set of numbers that the government presents every year, and try and make sense of it. And my attempt here today is going to be to talk to you about what the government actually told us a few days ago when the budget was presented. And I'll try and make it as simple as possible, but no simpler. So let's talk a little bit, as I did the last year. We start with the principle of what a budget is. What's a budget? It's very much similar to what you and I might be doing if we are very disciplined about it in our households, which is try and look forward and say, okay, what expenses are coming up? How much money do I need to spend? How much money do I actually make? And is it enough? And do I need to cut spends somewhere? Do I need to make more spends somewhere? Maybe my kid is going to college, so I need to make some big spends in investing in their education, etc. Maybe I need to buy a new house. That's a capital expenditure that's coming up, etc. There are equivalents of this for the government, and the government lists down, okay, all these are the different areas where I need to spend. And then the government says, okay, where am I going to get the money, right? And then they list down, here are the different places where I'm going to get the money. And what they're going to find, unlike most of us, what they're going to find is that they spend much more than they have, what they're going to make. Hopefully, you and I are not like that. Hopefully, you're in a place where what you spend is significantly lower than what you make. But governments, particularly governments in developing economies, tend not to be like that. Governments tend to spend a little bit more than what they make, right? And then the government says, okay, here's how much more I'm going to spend compared to what I make. Whatever the delta is, I'm going to borrow from the market, right? That's basically what a budget is conceptually. Let's dive in and let's see what the government said. How much money are they going to make and how much money are they going to spend? The government said that in this coming year, they expect to bring in about 34 lakh crores, right? It's a very big number, lakh crores. It's already kind of hard to wrap your head around what that number might actually mean. We all know what a lakh means. We all know what a crore means, but multiply them together. It's a massive number, 1 lakh crores, right? So instead of keeping on saying lakh crores, maybe I'll use the word trillion, right? So 34 trillion rupees is what the government said that they're going to bring in. That's the government's revenue. That is composed of two big things. How does the government make revenue? The biggest source is taxes, right? That's where much of the money comes from. So roughly 28 trillion of the 34 comes from taxes, right? So taxing you and me, individuals, businesses, and goods and services tax, all sorts of indirect taxes, everything put together, that's about 28 lakh crores, right? So taxes bring in 28 lakh crores, and there is some non-tax revenue that the government makes, not very big sums, but they add up to about 6 lakh crores. So put that together, that's about 34 lakh crores or 34 trillion. That's how much the government is expected to earn. By the way, many of us might wonder, there's been all this conversation about income taxes, right? And how income taxes have been reduced and so on. How big are income taxes as a part of the government's revenue? Income from individuals and taxes from corporates together, actually, let's just talk about individuals. Individual income taxes are about 14 lakh crores. So of the 34 lakh crores that the government makes, 14 comes from income from individuals. And you've heard all this conversation, only 1% of the individuals in the country are now going to pay taxes with the new regime that has been introduced and so on. I don't need to tell you that. So when people say, oh my God, very few people are bearing the burden of the entire government, it's kind of true, but not really fully. Income taxes are 14 lakh crores. And yes, it is on a small base, only 1% of the population ends up paying those taxes, especially in the new regime. But that's still only about a third or a little over a third of what the government's total revenues are. So income taxes form about 14 lakh crores, 10 lakh crores comes from corporate taxes, and GST brings in 12 lakh crores. Right? So 14 from individuals, 12 from GST, and 10 from companies. Those are the main sources, and then some 6 lakh crores from non-tax revenue. That's the 34 lakh crores that the government expects to make. By the way, one interesting thing that the government does every year, again, very good for us as individuals and as households to do as well. The government says, you know what I told you last year? How much money I was going to spend and how much money I was going to make? They revise that and say, here's how much I actually ended up doing. Here is how much money I actually ended up spending. So when you look at those numbers, the so-called revised estimates, compared to the budgets that the government originally presented, you can get a very good idea of, was the government disciplined in actually making the budgeting forecast? Or were they just smoking something? They just said whatever came to their mind and actual reality turned out to be very different. Some of us are like that, right? We make a budget, we say, okay, here's how much money I'm going to make. Turns out I made much less money than that. Or here's how much I'm going to spend, but turns out I spent a lot more money than that. One very interesting thing that you find in the government's budget numbers is that our government has been extremely disciplined in the way the projection versus actual has turned out. So what they said they were going to make is pretty much exactly what they have made on a line item by line item basis. And by the way, this is not just on the revenue side, but also on the expense side, where they said, I'm going to spend X amount of money. They spent pretty much exactly the X amount of money. They didn't spend a lot less or a lot more than that. That shows discipline. That shows that the government is on top of the numbers and that they really know exactly how to project, which gives you a little bit of confidence looking at the next year. Say, okay, what if you're saying this is how much you're going to make or spend, you will probably meet that as well because you've been doing that in the past, right? So that's one thing that strikes me. Let's go to the expenditures and then we'll come back. Remember, how much money was the government going to make? 34 lakh crores in this coming year. How much money are they intending to spend? 50 lakh crores. So 50 lakh crores is the sum of everything. So you can see that there's a 16 lakh crores somewhere. There's a ghost of 16 lakh crores hanging around. We'll come back to that ghost in a minute, right? Let's stick with the total amount of spends. 50 lakh crores is what the government intends to spend. Do you know what the biggest item is that the government spends on? Would you like to take 5 seconds and guess in your mind? What is it that the government spends the most on? Do you think it is, I don't know, defense, education, water, urban affairs? What is it that the government spends the most on? Turns out that the biggest single line of expenditure for the government is interest payment for past debt. Because they borrow every year. Because every year our expenditure is higher than what we earn. So every year we borrow. So that borrowing adds up over time. And so the single largest expenditure, just like many of us who have ever bought a house or something or bought a car recently, an EMI might be one of the largest expenses you have, the EMI you pay. Similarly, for the government, all the EMIs that they pay, essentially the interest that they pay is the single largest component. Of the 50 lakh crores, 13 lakh crores goes towards interest. In other words, 26% of all expenses of the government, give or take, let's say 1/4 of all expenses of the government are going towards interest payments, right? So that's a really big deal, all the interest that we have to pay for the past. So that takes away a chunk of money. And then you come to all the other stuff. What else does the government do? Well, it gives grants to states. So about 7 lakh crores, remember this is the central government's budget. The central government gives about 7 lakh crores to the states to run their affairs. Things like defense, railways and pensions. Those are the next 3 big items. They all take about 3 lakh crores each. We spent 3 lakh crores on defense. We spent 3 lakh crores on pensions of past government employees and 3 lakh crores on railways. Remember sometimes in the past, railways used to have its own budget. They used to do a whole thing. But over time, government realized, 3 lakh crores out of a total of 50. Why am I doing a whole darn budget just for that 3 lakh crores? I don't do that level of detail for anything else. So they just merged the whole thing into one, right? So now we just see one line item. It says, okay, railways is going to spend 3 lakh crores. I'm oversimplifying, but broadly speaking, right? So that spends a lot. A couple of things that I find interesting. Direct benefit transfers of various kinds. The government transfers all sorts of benefits to individuals directly. That's about 10 lakh crores, right? It's a very large sum of money. It has gone up only by 5 or 6%. I will come to that in a minute. It's gone up not by a lot. But there are some other interesting things you might just like to, like to know. How much money do you think the government spends on police all over the country? A lot of police money, of course, gets spent by the states. So some of it goes to the state budgets. But the government spends 1.5 lakh crores. That sounds like a lot of money. But we have a very large police force, 1.5 lakh crores. Right? But all of defense is 3 lakh crores. Remember, all Army, Navy, Air Force, all central government funded, 3 lakh crores. Police, 1.5 lakh crores. I found that interesting. Not good or bad, I just found it interesting. Education. How much money does the government spend on education? Remember, the total spends is 50 lakh crores. How much do we spend on education? 40,000 crores. So it's less than 1% of the total spends go towards education. Water and sanitation, right? All of us living in cities, like water coming to us, etc. It's a really big issue. A lot of people believe that water will be what causes the Third World War and all that type of stuff, right? It's a really big deal. Water and sanitation, 2,000 crores. It's so small that it just shocks me. Like, I almost feel like there's something wrong in the numbers, or maybe I'm just reading it wrong. But it just seems too small a number. But there are some interesting things like that, a little bit of head-scratching moments that you find sometimes. Anyway, on the whole, expenses have gone up by about 7%. Last year to this year, the government expects expenses to go up about 7%. And expenses, again, I saw the same thing that I spoke about on the revenue side. What the government projected last year from a budget perspective and what actually happened, very, very close to each other. So the government has again proven itself to be very good at predicting, or at least controlling their expenses. They're not like the drunkard who makes a plan at the beginning of the year, or beginning of the day even, and forgets as the evening progresses, right? But the government has been very disciplined and said, okay, here is how much I've spent already, time out. I'm not going to spend any more. And they've stopped it and things like that. So it's been really strong. Now, remember that 16 lakh crores that we left aside? Let's come back to that. 16 lakh crores, it's actually 15.7 is the delta between what the government wants to spend and what they actually earn. That is, for those who saw the video the previous year, the fiscal deficit. That number is called the fiscal deficit. The incremental delta of how much we are spending versus what we are making. That's the fiscal deficit. This number in absolute terms was also 15.7 crores in this year, in financial year 25. And what the government has said is that in absolute terms, I'm going to keep it exactly the same next year as well, right? So we will remain at the exact same rupee crore amount, but of course our GDP has gone up. And because our GDP has gone up, our GDP is now close to 350 lakh crores, right? So because the GDP has gone up by about 10%, remember we are talking about nominal basis. Many of you might remember or might say, oh, GDP only went up by 6%. That's true, but that's on a real basis, right? But all these numbers are on nominal basis, i.e. they are not inflation adjusted. So on a nominal basis, GDP went up by 10%. So we are at about 350 lakh crores. So as a percentage of GDP, the fiscal deficit last year was 4.8%, 10 basis points lower, 0.1% lower than what the government promised us. The government promised last year that they will be at 4.9% deficit. They actually brought it to 4.8%. So they did a little bit better than promised. They spent a little bit less than they said. And the next year, the government has now promised that we will bring it back down even further to 4.4%. Right? So another 40 basis points lower is what the government has promised. Now, is 4.4 a big number or a small number? For a country like India, it's an okay number. We used to be at peak 9% fiscal deficit. This was in the COVID year when the government had a ton of spending to do. In that year, we were 9% fiscal deficit. But in the years before COVID, we had actually come down. In 2014, we used to be 4.5%, right? But then everything shot up. When COVID happened, we all we went to a very bad space. And then we are trying to bring back down and come back to where we were 10 years ago. right? So we will be, if we end at 4.4 next year, which going by the government's track record, we probably should expect that we will be at 4.4 or better. We would have then slightly bettered where we were 10 years ago, which is 4.5%. So that's the other big story, is fiscal deficit has been kept under control. Then CapEx, right? Capital expenditure. Remember I said that some of us might be wanting to buy a house this year, right? That's capital expenditure, right? That type of thing the government does a lot. The government builds bridges, builds airports, right? Lots of capital expenditure that the government does. We have been increasing capital expenditure a lot in past years. This year, not that much. We spent about 10 lakh crores last year, and this coming year, government expects to spend 11 lakh crores. So a 10% increase. It is an increase, but it's not as much of an increase as some might have expected. Which brings me to the big themes of the budget. Theme number one we have already spoken about, which is fiscal deficit and fiscal discipline is being maintained, fiscal deficit is being brought down. Theme number two is CapEx is in absolute terms somewhat similar to where we were in FY25, not very different. So this year is not being showcased as a CapEx intensive year. This is not the year in which government is actually going to do a whole lot of really big things. In fact, I would make that a separate big theme itself, which is the government has said, you know what, the last 4, 5, 6 years, pretty much since COVID, the government has been the largest player in the economic circles in India. The economy has been running on one big engine, and that engine is government. What the government is saying now is that I'm going to take a little bit of a step back. And what they want is private consumption and MSMEs to come back in and fill that space. That's what this budget is about. This budget is about the government saying, I'm going to step back, guys. I've spent a lot in recent times. I'm going to step back. I want private sector to come in. Private consumption in particular to come in. Remember all that conversation and noise you've already heard about the income taxes and the reduction in income taxes? It's all towards driving consumption. The government saying, people, please consume more, and that will create a virtuous cycle in the economy. That's one thing that the government is pushing for. The other thing the government is pushing for is micro, small and medium enterprises, MSMEs, to actually do more business, hire more, export more, etc. And so those are the two big things that the government is spending. So that's kind of another really big, big element of the budget. The fourth thing that I'll say is, because the government is managing fiscal deficit well, and because they're not going to have to borrow a whole lot more from the market than last year, it means there is room for private enterprises, corporates, etc., to go and borrow. That's always a good thing, because then the corporates have the money, the capital, which they can then invest and do more in the economy. Remember, I said the government is inviting the private sector to do more. This is a way. The government borrowing a little bit less creates room for private sector to borrow. So that's the other sort of important big theme that is, that's happening. Finally, there were some policy announcements that happened. I'm not going to bore you with all the stuff on income taxes. You had a lot of very qualified people talk about it, and you know all about it. That obviously was the big hit of the budget. It got the most claps in the in the parliament, and pretty much it was a mic drop moment, and Ms. Sitharaman just left the stage right after saying that, because clearly it was such a big deal. So you don't need to tell me any more about that. There was also a very interesting announcement about 100% FDI being allowed in insurance. This has been a big demand of the industry for a long time. So you might now see some of the insurance companies becoming 100% foreign owned, or the foreign players actually buying another 24%. A lot of people are at 74%. They might buy another 26%, and they're at least allowed to actually go there and become a 100% owned entity. There was also, last year I had mentioned that there was a big sort of set of two states that got a lot of attention. That was Bihar and Andhra Pradesh. Got a lot of attention last year, right? This year the Bihar theme has continued. There's been a lot of Bihar-oriented announcements that have happened this year as well. So that also shows you geographically the intent of the government to actually push certain economies a little bit more, and certainly the East is going to see a lot of push. That's that's evident in this year as well, particularly Bihar. So that's it. That's the wrap as far as I can see. Overall, I would say a really steady kind of budget, which has essentially said the government steps back. The government says, I'm going to try and create an enabling environment for private consumption, for MSMEs to actually come forward and take the economy ahead. The government themselves have continued to show extreme discipline in driving the economy, in doing what needs to be done, but not going overboard, keeping borrowing intact, making room for the private sector, etc., and not rocking the boat in any particular way, right? Even though they've given up 1 lakh crores of revenue by this big income tax announcement, they have not had to cut down anything very significant. Some might argue that capital expenditure could have been a little bit higher if that 1 lakh crores had existed, but that's okay. I think you have to make some of these trade-offs. As we all know, when we do budgets, we have to make some of these trade-offs, and they have made, in my mind, a very good set of trade-offs to not do all the heavy lifting themselves, but inviting you and me, the private consumers, to go ahead and do our bit in bringing the economy forward. In other words, the government is saying, people, citizens of India, please step forward, make our country and make your contribution now. So there we are, you and I, it's over to us. Thank you very much for listening.